So if you don't know already, my name is Bradley Simpson, A&S Restoration Fellow, and I am the one who's been in charge of the forest survey that has been conducted at Woodend. So as I said, we'll be focusing on these species. They are not really related to each other, but I grouped them this way because of their very similar leaf shape, and we'll talk about that once we get to the leaf section of our presentation. We will be discussing different ways of identifying trees using twigs, bark, leaves, flowers, and fruits. And all of these characteristics are important in winter. Obviously, the twigs and the bark can be more important. And right now, we mainly are focusing on leaves and flowers and fruits, but we're going to be talking about all of them together. Now, because we have some returners and some new, I will have all the information from the first presentation in this presentation, but I will not be going as in depth into them as I did in the first one. I will remind everyone what we learned. For those who are new, if I don't go into too much depth for something, you can either ask a question or just wait until the end. I will be sending this presentation out for everyone so that you'll have this on file. So with that, I think that we can begin. Remember, like we said, if you have a question, chat is a great place to put it in. I will also have natural break points for people to ask questions after we finish talking about a subtopic. If there is a very pertinent question, my co-host Christian Mioli will interject me with that question. But like I said, there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions throughout this presentation. And like I said before, these species are not very related. We're focusing on our American sycamore, red maple, and sweetgum. And these fancy names that are italicized and bolded are the family names that our species are grouped in. So for a sycamore, they're in this Platanaceae group. It is a family that Platanus, this genus here that we see in the front, is the only extant genus for this family, and the American sycamore is the only species native to the United States within the family. Same goes for Sweetgum. There are other genus within the Altingiaceae, but liquid ambar is the only one native to the United States, our Sweetgum. And red maple, the Sapindaceae is a little bit different. That includes our maples and horse chestnuts, and there are over 138 species within that family. Like I said, not related taxonomically, but we will discuss their similarities when we get to the leaf portion of our presentation. So how to identify trees? We talked about the characteristic features last time. I just want to kind of add to that and say that characteristic features are used in the Dyke keys and apps and even other field guides. Using typical features is not really conducive for identifying a plant. If you were to take a picture of a typical leaf and send it to a naturalist, it would have a very difficult time trying to identify said species. So having characteristic features like a really interesting leaf shape, a thorn, or some flowers is very important for identification. And today we will be identifying a twig sample, but instead of using our tree finder like last time, we're going to do a little bit of an upgrade and use the common native trees of Virginia. And remember that the distinction between these two is that tree finder only has a key that allows you to identify an individual, whereas our common native trees of Virginia include species descriptions and illustrations for each of the species in the book. Now, other field guides are always good to have when you're identifying a tree, as well as tools we mentioned last time, specifically our hand lens. Even our field guides, even though they don't have a key, they still group the species within the book based off of a similar feature. So for example, Peterson's Field Guide to Eastern Trees groups the individuals based off of flower color, and that's how you would find the species you were looking for within the book. So I showed this slide last time. I also shared a link to a set of terms that is common in botanical language that is used in our keys and our species descriptions. I'm not going to repeat any of these except for palmate, which is new, and that is going to describe all the leaves of the species we're identifying today. And it just means lobed, veined, or divided from a common point like the fingers of a hand. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started with our specific features. So remember, you can have alternate, opposite, or world species, and this refers to the arrangement of the leaf and the buds along a stem of a tree. So our alternate means that at each point where a leaf is, there's only one leaf with no other leaf or bud on the opposite side of the stem from that leaf. Whereas an opposite, you have two leaves at every point, and in a world you have multiple. So today, one of our species is oppositely arranged, and I wanted to go ahead and take this time to introduce a saying that will help you remember some of our species that are oppositely arranged. There are a lot fewer oppositely arranged species than there are alternate. So that little saying is what I learned a couple years ago back in college, and it's Mad Vibes Lonnie. So the MAD is an acronym for maples, ashes, and dogwoods. Then Vibes is viburnums. Lonnie is lonicera or honeysuckle. And then others that aren't included in this saying that are opposite are elderberry, horse chestnut, and buckeyes. Buckeyes and horse chestnuts are in the Sapindaceae family with the maples. And I pictured here what those oppositely arranged species look like. And it's not just the leaves. You can see here in our maple, even the branching will be opposite too. And it is you can see that very well when you look up in the trees of ashes. You can see that all the branches are oppositely arranged. All right. So with our twigs, I just wanted to show this picture again and remind people to pay attention to terminal versus axillary, just the position of our buds. Terminal referring to the end of a stem, axillary meaning the axil of a leaf scar and a stem. I will go into more depth of what an axil is in a couple of slides. I just wanted to mention it here. The axil refers to the leaf scar and the stem. So if you have to imagine there's a leaf at that leaf scar, so you can see that angle between the stem and the leaf. And at any point where there is a bud or a leaf, that is a node, and the gap between those 2 points are internodes. So I said terminal versus axillary refers to the position of buds. Terminal or apical refers to the end of a stem, where an axillary bud refers to in the axil of a leaf in a stem. So an axil is really just an angle between two features. So when we refer to a bud, it means it's an axil between the leaf and the tree stem. We can also have axils and other features of our tree, such as between the primary and secondary veins of the leaves. So those are vein axils. But it really is just an angle between two features on a tree. So I did go quickly through that information just because most of it was from last time, but I wanted to pause here before actually going into a new topic for some questions. Well, if we have none, I'm going to go straight into something we didn't talk about last time, which is bark. So there are many, many, many types of bark, and you can see it all within our Bark, a field guide to trees in the Northeast. Very, very useful for winter. But in Maryland, we oftentimes have species that are native to the Northeast, but as well as to the Southeast. So this book will not include all of our trees that we see here in Maryland, such as the persimmon. Persimmon is a more southernly native species, and it would not be included in this book. But for an overall, for a decent overall bark book, this is definitely what I would suggest. It does actually have a key too in the beginning that helps you identify a tree just based off its bark. So the different types are, we have smooth, unbroken bark, very indicative in our beech trees, seen at the bottom right. We have peeling bark, like our birches, most of our birches. So you see our river birch in our top right. We also have ones with visible lenticels, and those are the horizontal lines that you see on cherries. These lenticels refer to gas exchange pores in the tree. You can also have vertical cracks and seams and otherwise smooth bark, and that will usually reveal the color of the inner bark as seen in the hickory. And you can see the red that is revealed in the cracks and seams. Now, a crack refers to often begins at a lenticel. The crack will start at where the lenticel is on a tree, and a seam is referred to as something like a stretch mark on a tree. You can also have scales, which are of roughly similar size on a tree, though the individual shapes can vary. This is well seen in our mature black cherry trees, which is on the far right. We also have plated bark, so larger and typically stiffer than scales, and that can be seen in our flowering dogwood. And vertical strips, just these strips of bark that are at least 3 times longer than wide, which can be seen in our red maple, mature red maple. When a red maple is younger, it's very smooth, and when our black cherry is younger, you can actually see the horizontal lenticels are much more easily seen, and they hasn't formed its scales yet. So bark can change through maturity. We also have ridges and furrows. A ridge is really just where thick bark separates, creating these deep furrows, which are just channel depressions. So it's ridge-like structures formed from the building of thick bark. So that's what a ridge and furrow refers to. You can have intersecting ridges. You can have intersecting ridges that are not completely separated, creating a lot of differently sized furrows, and those are well seen in our ashes, or white and green ash in the bottom left. Or ridges can be broken horizontally. So we see here in our black oak that the ridges and furrows are in a horizontal pattern. So that's our black oak. And then uninterrupted ridges, where there are ridges that extend for 12 inches or longer without being interrupted, and that can be seen in our red oak. So this was new information from last time. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here for questions as well before we get into our winter features of our trees. All right, then we will continue. So our American sycamore, lots of really indicative features on our tree. Well, first, our leaf scars are arranged alternately along the stem. Our mature brown outer bark peels to reveal a striking white inner bark. This inner bark can sometimes be tan or greenish, but it's usually this really striking white, and it does not go down all the way out the trunk. Usually about 10 feet of the base of the trunk is not exfoliating, is not peeling. The seed balls hang singly or in pairs from twigs throughout the winter. So those are these down here, which is an aggregate of many seeds, but we'll discuss that later when we get to our fruit section. The leaf scars, which you can kind of make out along our bud here, they completely encircle the bud. Our sycamore leaves are very large, and thus our leaf scars are proportionally large. Our buds are brown, conical, and consist of only one scale. So the bud scale is a adapted leaf part that protects the bud. All right. In our sweetgum, our leaf scars are arranged alternately here as well. Our terminal bud is a lot larger than our axillary buds, and this is because of it including the flowering parts of our tree. Our twigs are shiny and aromatic, and they sometimes have these corky wings that we see here. and the twigs consist of these small white lenticels. And then these hard, spiky fruits hang on individuals throughout the winter. So it's these here, definitely not fun to step on when you're barefoot walking around outside. But those are our sweet gum fruits. So in our red maple, this one's different. Our leaf scars are arranged opposite of each other along the stem. Buds are very globular and have many scales, and the terminal buds are slightly longer than the axillary ones along the stem. Our young twigs are very red in color with these small white lenticels. Our young trunks are smooth and light to dark gray, and then those vertical cracks I mentioned earlier start to develop on our more mature trunks, becoming very consistent and forming long plate-like strips. So those are our winter features for our 3 species. So again, I'm just going to take a quick pause for questions.
Hey, Bradley, we have some questions from the chat.
Okay.
So someone was wondering if bark and scales are interchangeable terms.
So a scale is a bark feature. So it describes the bark. It's more, it wouldn't really be interchangeable. It is like the scales of the tree is the bark, but it is a type of bark. It describes how the bark is on the tree.
Great. And then we had another one that was, is there a difference between a sycamore and a plane tree?
So we'll actually talk about the difference between the London plane tree, Platanus exacerifolia, and the Sycamore, Platanus occidentalis at the end. I will mention right now that London plane tree is a hybrid between 2 species, an oriental plane tree that is native to Eurasia and our American sycamore.
Someone was wondering if older bark has lenticels.
It depends on the tree. It can sometimes. So our lenticels are apparent. If a tree has lenticels, it's going to have lenticels throughout its lifespan. Those lenticels may become less noticeable, such as in our black cherry. They're very striking when the cherry tree is young, but when they start to form those scales, they can be hard to see, but they still are there. For example, our other cherry trees, even in maturity, the non-native ones still have the visible horizontal lenticels. So it really is, they're there. It's just depending on the species, they might be a little bit harder to see.
Okay. And so going on lenticels, someone was wondering, how does a tree breathe if they don't have lenticels?
So there's these features on the leaf called stomata. Stomata is a feature that opens during the day and allows for water uptake from the roots, and it creates a circulation through the tree from the roots to the leaf, and through the stomata there can be releases of gas there as well as water.
Someone was wondering why sycamores are whiter than others.
Whiter than others?
Sycamores.
So there is lots of individual variability within trees. It's really just down to genetics. No one tree is going to look like another, except for when you get to like sumacs and aspen, which are clonal, and then you have trees looking like each other because they are the same tree, literally the same individual.
And then the last one I see here is, are all axillary buds flower buds, and are all terminal buds stem or, sorry.
Okay. I think I understand the question.
Yeah.
So no, it really depends on the species. For example, if we're talking about a horse chestnut, the terminal bud will always consist of leaf and flower features. In most cases, like in our eastern redbud, there are separate flower and leaf buds. And for the redbud, the flower buds can be either terminal or axillary, mostly axillary, but usually they're separate.
Great. That's all the questions I see in the chat for right now.
Okay, So we're going to move into our leaf anatomy. Again, we'll be repeating some information, but I will move through it more quickly like I did at the beginning. And then we'll talk about how they specifically relate to our species we're focusing on today. So in our leaf anatomy, we have a simple versus a compound leaf. And this really just refers to the position of the bud along the leaf. On a simple leaf that is not divided or composed of leaflets, the bud is right down here where the leaf would attach to the stem. On a compound leaf, we have no buds between our leaflets and only a bud here at the end of the leaf stem attached to the twig. And then we can have these differently types of divided leaves, pinnately or palmately. And palmately, again, remember, it just refers to divided at a common point. So this is our common point, like the shape of a hand. So these would be like our fingers. So in our shape and arrangement, I want to highlight our palmate and lobed. So we did discuss lobes last time with oaks, but I do want to mention it again because our leaves today are said to be lobed in a palmate shape. So this palmate, even though it's separate from lobed, it just means that it's lobed in the shape of a hand. So this still consists of sinuses and lobes, although having a different name for the feature. For our leaf bases and leaf apex, we're really going to be focusing on truncate and cordate today. So truncate just means squared off at the end as if it was cut off. So our Sweetgum and Sycamore can have truncate leaf bases or cordate as well. And those features can be seen on the same individual, again, with individual variability between each leaf, even on the same tree. And then our apex, most of our trees today, our leaves have an acute apex, each lobe having an acute apex. In our venation and margin, I just wanted to remind everyone what a primary versus secondary vein is. The primary vein is the vein that extends from the leaf stem and is branched with secondary veins. And when the secondary vein is branched from the primary vein, it creates a vein axle. But today, all of our trees have palmately veined leaves. So this means that there are several primary veins emerging from the point in which the leaf stem becomes the leaf. So it emerges from that point. Usually each lobe has its own primary vein. So it'll have an equal number of lobes and equal number of primary veins. Despite being lobed, our margins also are serrate too for all of our species. And these serrate, remember serrate refers to these forward pointing teeth, so pointing towards the tip of the leaf. I mentioned this last time as well with our oaks. It mainly refers to oaks or sunburst shade leaves, but this feature can be seen in maples and sycamore too, and it really refers to just the size of the leaf. Our shade leaves, our bottom canopy leaves, in maples and sycamore will be a lot larger than the ones in the top canopy or the sun leaves. So again, with the end of the leaf portion, I'm going to take a quick pause for questions. Okay. Good time. So for our American sycamore, remember Platanus occidentalis, our leaves are alternate and simple, so by themselves and not divided into leaflets. The leaf shape is reniform, so if you were to kind of fill in the sinuses between the lobes and complete that shape of the leaf, it would be shaped almost like a kidney. And this is a picture of a kidney-shaped pool. So I have to put that in there just so that we can make sure we have an idea of what a kidney looks like. Our leaf bases are truncate, so squared off or cut off at the base, but they can also be cordate too, so heart-shaped. The leaves are pubescent below, so hairy, when young and becoming smooth throughout the year as they mature. Right before they fall off in the fall, you'll notice that hairs are present in the vein axils between the primary and the secondary veins. The leaves can be 3 to 5 lobed, while also serrate with long pointed teeth. You can see these very, very long teeth, but all still pointing towards the tip of the leaf. And has very long petioles, up to 12 centimeters in size. For our Sweetgum, our leaves are also alternate and also simple. It also has a reniform shape. If you were to rounded, if you were to fill in the sinuses here too, they would either be a nice rounded or kidney shaped. The leaf base is also cordate to truncate. The leaf margin can be 2 to 7 lobed very deeply too. You can see how deep these lobes are, almost getting it more than halfway towards the primary veins in the middle. And the lobes are triangular, acute, and very much smaller serrate than they are in the sycamore. These really tiny teeth, but still pointing towards the tip of the leaf. And the leaves are very smooth, glabrous. And our red maple, remember their leaves are opposite. They're usually 3 lobed, but they can be very rarely. They'll be 5 lobed, like pictured here on the left on a newly emerging leaf. We have these 2 bottom lobes that create the 4th and 5th lobes of the leaf. They can sometimes be present. The margins are serrate to irregularly dentate, and dentate refers to just equally sized teeth that are just pointing straight out from the margin and not distinctly pointing forward towards the tip. And the leaves are glaucous and pubescent on the veins beneath. So the glaucous is everywhere on the underside of the leaf, but is only pubescent on the veins. Remember that glaucous refers to just this really bluish green coating that we see here. And it's not a permanent coating. It can easily be rubbed off. And I'm going to show an example of that. Christian is going to switch to his screen and show this in a video. Since my presentation is PDF, I'm not able to do it, but it'll start here. And you can see those lines that are made by my finger. Really easy to rub off. And that's what glaucous is, just that bluish green coating. So Christian, you can go ahead and switch back. And again, I will take this time to pause for questions.
We had a question about sweet gums. Someone recently saw a sweet gum that had rounded lobes instead of it being pointed. So they were wondering if it was perhaps a cultivar.
It could be a cultivar. It's hard to say without seeing the leaf for myself. They are usually pretty triangular, but again, like I mentioned, leaf shape can be variable. So it could just be a weird looking leaf on a tree. That is sometimes a feature that can happen. I can't say for sure, again, without seeing the leaf, but yes, there are lots of cultivars, especially for our, a lot of our very common trees like Sweetgum.
Someone is wondering more about the glaucous coating and like what is it? Maybe like what it's made of, or
no, I'm not really sure exactly what it's made of, like what part, like how it's formed. I know it's usually used for protection of a leaf, so like an insect wouldn't really want to eat through a glaucous coating. Other than me being able to say that it is a coating that you can rub off, I really can't say much more. I really don't know what it is made of. I can find out for next time.
Someone's wondering about the hairy new leaves and stems, and if a lot of trees and shrubs have that, or is that something that distinguishes them from other species?
So some leaves are smooth all the time. So in our Sweetgum, they're always smooth. But yes, there are a lot of species that do have hairy features when they're emerging. And that's just because the leaves are vulnerable at that point and the hairs do provide protection for the leaf. But usually once the leaves are fully out, they will lose all of those features. But sometimes they will persist for a little bit longer and even remain. So like in our sycamore, the pubescence persists throughout the year more so than it does in other species like Sweetgum, and even persisting throughout the entire year, even just in a lesser form. So instead of being throughout the leaf in the sycamore, it's in the vein axils. This is also seen in black oak. Black oak is very orange pubescent throughout most of the year, but like towards the fall, it will lose most of that except for in the vein axils. So it's not in some species it's a distinguishing feature, but for a lot of our emerging leaves, they do have pubescence.
Great. That's all the questions we have right now in the chat.
Okay. So I will keep going then, and we'll talk about flowers. So I did mention our flowers can be in these arrangements called inflorescences. So today we're really going to be focusing on racemes. Raceme is basically a spike right here. A spike is shown as just a vertical stem, flower stem that has flowers along it. But the difference between a spike and a raceme is that our flowers are branched, so they include a pedicel. So a pedicel is the flower stem. So it's like a petiole, but for a flower. So petioles are leaf stem. So raceme are branch flowers off of a pedicel. And then in our sycamores, we have simple flowers. So they're just singly, just by themselves, but they're formed in a head. But instead of being flat like an aster, the head is actually a ball of flowers. And we'll see that in the next slide. And I just wanted to reiterate what meris refers to, and that just refers to our numbers of petals, whether it's 5 meris or 4 meris. Like 5 meris is our rose. So all of our rose, anything in the rose family is always going to be 5 meris, 5 petals, and anything in the dogwood family is always going to be 4 petaled. And then our catkins, which are a little bit different, that are just drooping flowers that we see in oaks and hickories. So for our flowers, for our species today, the sycamore, like I said, has this solitary pendulous flower head with very distinctive red on the green head. Our Sweetgum has very distinctive male and female flowers. The male flowers are the racemose. So racemose is how we describe a raceme when we're describing the feature being there. And the female flowers that we see down here are pendulous. So this would tell us that our species is wind pollinated. Our male flowers are usually higher than the female flowers. As the pollen falls down from the males and the wind blows, it's easier for pollination to occur. So this means that this tree can pollinate itself. So self-pollination is possible on Sweetgums. Maples also have male and female flowers, a little bit less distinctive. But here in our male flowers, you can see these stamens all on the edge, and that is our feature that are only on male flowers. And our female flowers are lacking those stamens, so that shows us that these are the female ones. But they're born in fascicles, so a cluster, and just refers to a tight cluster. Another term that fascicle is usually used for pine trees. So the needles are usually born in fascicles. So there's a collection of needles in one cluster. Like in our more common pine, our eastern white pine has got 5 needles in one fascicle. There are always 5 needles grouped together. So I'll just take another pause real quick and see if there are any specific questions about our flowers. All right. With that, I'll move right into our fruits. So I mentioned last time there are lots of different types of fruits that are that exist in the plant world. Today, we're really focusing on just 2. So the first one is an achene, this closed-fitting pericarp surrounding a single seed. And the pericarp refers to just usually the fleshy membrane that surrounds a leaf and surrounds a seed and protects it. So this would be like the fleshy part of an apple or an orange. but in this case, it's a closed hard coating. So like a sunflower, you have to break open the pericarp around it to get to the seed. So our the Samara is our fruits of a maple, and that refers to an achene that is winged. So we'll see an example of that when we get to our that specific slide with pictures from each of our species. And the sycamore is also an achene, but it's an aggregate of many, many achenes fit together, and they're kind of in the shape of railroad spikes. And we'll see a picture of that soon. Our Sweetgums are a little bit different. They are capsules. So it's also an aggregate. It's an aggregate of small two-celled capsules that form a spiked ball. Inside each capsule are one or two winged seeds. And I keep saying winged. It is because all of our seeds for all these species mentioned here are wind dispersed. So a sycamore does not have wings per se, but they have these hairy features, kind of similar to a dandelion, that allows the seed to float in the wind. And you get this railroad spike shaped seed that is the achene that actually has this seed right up here at the top. And they're all grouped together in the balls here, the seed balls. The maple fruits, like I said, is a samara. It's a winged achene containing one seed. So these are our wings and the achene there. And as a kid, I used to call these the helicopters. And you throw them up and they spin around like a helicopter as they fall to the ground. That helps with dispersal. And our Sweetgum, like I said, is an aggregate of those small capsules, each with one or two winged seeds. And this is kind of the development of it throughout the year as it becomes more brown. And in the winter, we see those brown spiky balls hanging from the tree or on the ground right around the tree. So with that is our fruit. And we'll stop again and ask about questions, and then we will go into identifying a twig sample with the common native trees of Virginia. That kind of is key.
We had a question about the botanical difference between trees that self-pollinate and trees that require separate male and female trees.
Mm-hmm. So that really, it refers to just genetics in that point, and the ability to have more variable populations in regards to its genetics. So ones that self-pollinate are not going to be very dissimilar from the tree in which it came from, but those that are dioecious will have a lot more genetic variability within the new individuals. And in regards to how this affects the population as a whole, hollies would be a lot less vulnerable to any disease or disturbance because they have that higher genetic variability, whereas self-pollinated trees would be more susceptible to diseases and disturbances because there is not a lot of genetic variability.
Great. This question is specifically about maples, and they were wondering if female and male flowers are on the same tree for maples.
Yes, they are.
Okay. And then someone was wondering if trees need pollinators to reproduce, or is it just work with wind and gravity?
I would say for a lot of our trees, it's wind and gravity, but there are, like in our rose, are more fragrant flowers and the flowers that look more like an actual flower, like in our rose and dogwood, those would be pollinated by various insects. But just want to make sure there's no more questions, and then I want to actually go into, we kind of brought up some terms that aren't said yet, but we talked about them. We talked about hollies and having separate male and female. It refers to dioecious, whereas in our maples and sycamore, they're monoecious. They have the same, you're gonna have both the male and female flowers on one individual. And dioecious, again, is separate individuals or male and female. Now, in some cases, things can change. In mulberries, they are very gender fluid. A mulberry tree can start off male, become female, and then change back again. So in reference to gender in trees too, it can be as fluid as we see in humans today. So if there's no more questions, I'm going to move on to some comparison with similar species. All right. So for our maples, we have a lot of different maples native to the area. So our first one, our silver maple, which I would say looks most like our red maple, but our lobes are much more divided than they are in the red maple, almost coming down to this central mid vein, to the central primary vein. They almost cut all the way to it. But in the winter, it might be a little bit more difficult to tell these two apart since the bark is very, very similar. Even the color of the twigs can be similar, although the silver maple is usually more orangish red and not as striking red as red maple. An easy characteristic is to break the stem. Red maple will have no fragrance really, but a silver maple will have a very disgusting aroma to it. And I can't really describe it. It's just bad. It's really not good. Box elder, they have a more brownish bark, unlike our gray and our silver and red maple. And the big difference here in the leaf is that it is a compound leaf. It is our only maple that is compound leaf. So we see here it can have 3 to 5 leaflets on one leaf. And the stem for the box elder is very, very green rather than a reddish or a red-orange. Then we have our sugar maples, which can be kind of brown or transitioning to more gray as it matures. And the leaves are very, they're 5-lobed most of the time. I don't really see any leaf on a sugar maple that isn't 5-lobed. And it has these very distinctive squared off blocks within the lobes. And I kind of compare these to the shape of sugar cubes. So that helps me remember that the ones with the sugar cube shaped lobe is a sugar maple. And then another maple that's really common here is a Norway maple. Obviously by the name of it, you can tell that it is not native, and it is actually invasive here in this region. We have plenty of them at Woodend. The leaves look a lot similar to sugar maple, but are more so 7-lobed than they are 5-lobed, consisting of a 6th and 7th lobe at the base of the leaf. But the big difference here is that in the spring and summer, you can pull off a leaf and see this milky white sap right here that is not in any of our other native species here in this region. If you do get up more north or more in the Appalachia, you start to get into some other maple species that do have milky sap. But for right here in this region, in this specific area, we do not have any other maples with milky sap other than Norway maple. So this is just a illustration from Florida, Virginia that shows a lot of our maple leaves and samaras. They can take some very interesting shapes here, just like this Pennsylvania maple. I'm just gonna go ahead and move on to our comparison with our London plane tree. So like I said before, this is a hybrid of our Oriental plane tree from Eurasia and our Native American sycamore. This was created to become a very typical street tree. It's very tolerant of air pollution. If you go to London, they have like plane trees everywhere lining their streets and not really caring about the urban situation in which they're in. Difference here is that they're not very white as our American sycamore, although some individuals can show a white inner bark. They're mostly green, tan, and brown when they peel. And they peel all throughout the trunk, all the way to the base where it connects to the ground, whereas our American sycamore, usually the last 10 feet of the trunk to the ground is not peeling. So right before we're about to go into the identification of our sample, so I'm just going to pause to see if there's any questions about our comparison with other species.
Someone was wondering about maples and when they reach maturity. Is it a specific age, or is it just vary, or is there like a determined age that defines a younger maple and a mature maple?
It varies. I have seen trees that I would refer to as young, already showing the features of mature bark, so having those vertical strips. But I've also seen more mature maple that you would assume would have those vertical strips, but are more smooth and showing its characteristic of young bark. And that could just be a function of how fast the tree was able to grow and its availability of light. I would say that there's not a really distinct age where they would start flowering and forming fruits or they reach maturity. But for other species like oaks, they have a distinct age. So they won't usually start forming acorns until they're at least 40 years old.
So there's like two questions that kind of relate to the London plane tree as like street trees. So they were wondering why Europe or London might prefer the hybrid instead of, just the American sycamore. And then going off that, they were wondering, are more street trees here plane trees and not sycamores?
So most of our street trees, if it looks like a sycamore, it's a London plane tree. This is just a species that is chosen because of its tolerance to urban pollution, being in a small space, like in just like a little tiny square along a sidewalk. Whereas the native species, both in Europe and here, are a little more vulnerable to those disturbances, so they will be less likely to survive. And the London plane tree, as seen in London, has shown that it is able to survive over 100 years in a small urban street. So that's why they're more generally planted. I mean, they created it specifically for cities.
And do we find the London plane trees like out in the wild or in other natural areas?
I haven't really
seen
them.
Mostly American sycamores.
It's mostly American sycamore. I actually don't really come across London plane trees growing randomly along in a forest, but it is always good to just run through a key and check. But or just like looking for that characteristic feature. The sycamore will not be have exfoliating bark at the bottom of the trunk. But it is mostly American sycamore that you find in the wild.
Great. I think that's it for the questions in the chat for right now.
Okay. So we're gonna run through our common native trees of Virginia Key with our Sweetgum. So this is a leaf sample I collected just yesterday. And this is a picture of when the leaves are just emerging in Sweetgum when I was first doing it back in April for a UMD class. So we're gonna start right at the beginning, differentiating between our evergreen trees and our more broadleaf trees. So it asks if our leaves are needle or scale-like, or if our leaves are broad and flat. So our leaf is very broad and flat, so it does not look like a pine or a spruce or a cedar. It's definitely a deciduous broadleaf tree. So we're going to go to 14 in this book. So you'll see that a lot of the keys will start off with the same features because they are very useful in differentiating large groups of trees. So this next couplet is asking if it's opposite or alternate. Always the first feature you look for in deciduous broadleaf trees or hollies, which are not deciduous. So our leaves, as we see here, are alternately arranged. They do not have another leaf right opposite of them at that node. Remember, a node is any point that a leaf emerges from the stem. So because they're alternate, we'll go to 25, so number 25 in the series. So you'll remember that in Tree Finder, we only had illustrations that showed us where to go within the key. This one is numbered, and I think is a lot more easy to follow. I think a number is a lot easier to find than an illustration among illustrations that look the same. So at 25, it asks if our leaf is compound or simple. Because our leaf is only divided into lobes, but not into separate leaflets, our leaf is simple. The stem right here attaches, and it's not really visible, but there is a tiny, tiny little bud starting to form there for the, that would be its overwintering bud that will leaf out next year. So our leaf is simple, and we're gonna go to 36, where it asks if our leaves are lobed, with or without teeth, or have large rounded teeth appearing like a wavy margin, or if the leaves are not lobed and may or may not be toothed or spined. So it's just, is it lobed or not? And we definitely have lobes. So remember that our lobes is that extension of a leaf with the depression being the sinuses. So our leaf is lobed, which means we'll just go right below 36 to 37. And in 37, it asks how vein the feature of the veins, if they are palmately veined and toothed or wavy margin, or if they're pinnately veined. So here we can distinctively see at least 5 primary veins that have secondary veins branching off of them. And you can really tell if it's a primary vein if they all have a similar thickness to them. If they're they just look similar. They're distinctive from the secondary ones because they do not have that same thickness as the primary veins. So leaf is palmately veined, and we'll go right below to 38. Where it asks if our leaves are less than 4 inches long, coarsely toothed, lobe shallow present, leaf white and hairy underneath, or if our leaves are not white underneath, lobes fairly obvious if present. So our lobes, I would say, are pretty obvious. We have these very distinctive sinuses, and the leaves are not white underneath, but we'll note that there are these tiny little tufts of hair in our vein axils. So it's not white underneath, but it still can have some hairs. So then we go to 39, where it really refers to the seeds here, because in B it mentions only the seeds, or in A it's asking if the fruit is red, purple, or bumpy, or if we have a seed that is a spiky ball. So we have a spiky ball seed. So this is it forming on our Sweetgum. This was just taken just yesterday. And then once you get there, we actually are differentiating between a sycamore and a Sweetgum. And in a sycamore, you'll remember that we have 3 to 5 large lobes that are triangular with irregular teeth, and our seeds in a bumpy ball. Whereas on our Sweetgum, we have star-shaped leaves with 5 to 7 lobes, mostly 5 generally, very finely toothed, and the bark can have these corky ridges and seeds in a spiky ball. So we had that spiky ball, we had the star-shaped leaf, 5 lobes, very finely toothed, and this individual actually had the corky wings on it. But remember what I said earlier is that those corky wings are not always there. But this one did, and because of all of those features, we have identified a Sweetgum. A lot of the language here was similar in Tree Finder. There's not, when you refer to the key, other than using numbers instead of illustrations, it's very similar. Even the number of species that each includes is very similar, but the big difference between the Common Native Trees of Virginia book and the Tree Finder is the species description. So this is the species description for Sweetgum within Common Native Trees of Virginia. And it tells you a lot more about the characteristics within the tree that helps you just make sure that it is the tree you are looking at. And it's interesting, I noticed this yesterday, is that this book has a very interesting description of one feature, and it describes its flammability. So apparently Sweetgum is low flammability. I just think that's interesting. I'm not sure why they put it there. But yes, so that is the end of identifying our sample. So I will just make sure there are no other questions, and that is really the end of the presentation.
Someone had a question about fruit, and so they're wondering if fruit was necessary to identify the Sweetgum.
It is not necessary. There are lots of other features now in that key. So if we go back to that key, there were a lot of other features there that in this last couplet that didn't need the seed. But in this one, there was also the couplet before where it only referred to the seed. So in this key, yes, you would need the seed and Sweetgum, but there are a lot of keys, other keys that will be more, give a little bit more options. Now here we also, in A, it does say that some leaves unload, others with several loads. Sweetgum does not have that feature. So it's kind of like, instead of saying, yes, we have this, you would say, no, we don't have this. We don't have what's in A, so we have to go with what's in B. So it's kind of, keys can kind of be tricky in that way, where sometimes you won't have a feature they're referring to, and you have to kind of look deeper into how you might figure out what individual you have. Any other questions?
Not any questions from the chat.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I volunteered at Nature Center during off and on throughout the year, and it's a two-part question. One thing we were looking at doing a display or an exhibit on trees and how to identify them. One of the things we were looking to do is you picture a board. On the left-hand side, a picture of the leaf, so you could identify it in summertime. On the right-hand side, a picture of the bark, so you can maybe identify it in the wintertime.
Mm-hmm.
And in between, just some bullet points of facts about that tree. I just want to see what you think of that. And is there any suggestions of some good locations we could go for information? I know that might be that's a lot I'm asking.
Yeah, I think that is a great idea. Just so that also, like, when they're looking at it in the winter, when they have that picture of the leaf, they can visualize what that tree looks like when it does have the leaves. Now, sometimes I will say it can get tricky because for some trees, the leaves can be very typical shaped, not really having distinct features, so they could look a lot similar to other species. And same with the bark. Some bark can look very, very similar between species. So if you're doing a species that has a typical leaf or a typical bark, maybe choose a feature that is present in spring that's a little bit more characteristic, maybe a flower or a fruit. And same with winter. If there's a feature, if the bark's a little bit nondescript, there might be a different winter feature that would be more characteristic and help with identifying. But for most species, I would say, yeah, that's a great thing to do. Give people an idea of what this tree looks like throughout the season. In regards to resources, just as many books. I would just say the keys are very helpful because if you go backwards from a species in a key, then you can look at the features it refers to within the key, and those would be features that you would want to highlight, the ones that are mentioned in the key, because those are the ones that are going to be important for differentiating species. So just having a variety of keys and field guides that really let you know what the distinctive features of a tree is. But other than that, there's a lot of websites out there that have really great tree descriptions. Go Botany, which is a tree identification site. I can send out some of these resources. I think I might have no, Go Botany's on this one. But Go Botany is a really good one. Minnesota Wildflowers, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflowers, which also has trees and shrubs, are really good websites that have basically every single feature of the species listed. And even in the Lady Bird, it'll tell you like when they bloom, what type of habitat you'll find them in. And I can send out links to these resources after the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just had one last question. It was about sugar maples, and if you thought that they could still do well here, maybe in Maryland, even with climate change and the threat from that for their species.
The sycamore?
The sugar maple.
The sugar maple. So it is a very more northern related species. So we're seeing that ranges are changing for species because of climate change. So those that are more northern, are going to move more north. So they might not be here in some years because of the climate being too hot for them. And similarly, the southern range species would be able to kind of migrate more north because of that changing climate. So yes, sugar maple could be influenced here in Maryland because of climate change and because of its need for a more northern temperate climate.
Kind of what I thought. And for the Anne Arundel replant initiative, Replant Anne Arundel County, it's one of the resilient trees listed for planting. I just thought that was strange.
I would say they're definitely resilient in regards to everything other than climate change. I would say that like for sugar maple to move out of Maryland, it would take quite a while for climate change to do that, but it is still something that could potentially happen. But I would say, again, not for a long period of time.
I just think if you're newly planting something, that maybe something more tolerant, heat tolerant would be better. But okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I love them. Don't get me wrong.
No, they are really cool. I mean, they could be doing it if they have other intended uses. I know for some places they are creating food forests, so that would be like a good food forest tree to plant because of this sap within it. But I don't know what the goals are of the planting.
I was just increasing forest canopy in Anne Arundel County, since we've lost the most forest canopy of any county in Maryland.
Really?
They set aside $200,000 for replanting Anne Arundel County.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah, we're trying to recapture some of that lost canopy.
Oh, interesting. Well, sugar maples will definitely grow up into the canopy very quickly. They're a pretty fast growing tree.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.